The gas lamps along Pennsylvania Avenue burned low in the early hours of a February morning in 1862, their light reaching only partway across the wet cobblestones before dissolving into the surrounding dark. Inside the executive mansion, the name by which the White House was still commonly known in those years, the second-floor corridor ran unlit between doors that were rarely secured, because the building itself was rarely secure against the general public. Visitors wandered its ground-floor rooms most mornings without appointment or prior arrangement, waiting on wooden benches for the chance to speak with the president, leaving behind combined smell of pipe tobacco, damp wool coats, and with smoke from the fireplaces that struggled to heat the drafty, high-ceilinged rooms. The building groaned in the wind that moved off the Potomac in winter. The river lay only a few hundred yards out of the grounds, and it carried a persistent low smell through the colder months, a quality that those who lived and worked in the mansion eventually learned to accommodate without quite forgetting. In the rooms above these public spaces, the life of Abraham Lincoln continued in ways that his contemporaries recorded with more care than is sometimes credited, and that later generations have tended to pass over quickly on their way toward the larger events. The man who held the presidency through the most destructive years in American history was also a man who suffered episodes of depression, so severe that those closest to him had, on more than one occasion, thought it prudent to remove sharp objects from his vicinity. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed, during his White House years, somewhere close to 175 pounds, a lean, angular figure on a frame that seemed built for a heavier life. His hands were large and permanently roughened, and they never lost the texture of the physical labor that had made them in early youth. Channels devoted to this kind of slow, particular history are worth keeping close. Subscribing takes only a moment, and it means evenings like this one are always within reach. The story of what Lincoln's private life actually looked like begins not in Washington, not in Illinois, but in the borderland of Kentucky, in the winter of 1809. The land around sinking Spring Farm in Hardin County, Kentucky, was heavily wooded in the winter of 1809. The trees bare and gray-barked against the pale sky, the ground frozen in shallow ridges where the soil had cracked in the cold. The spring itself, a freshwater source that gave the small property its name and much of its practical value, lay at the bottom of a gentle slope, and the limestone formation around it held the cold in a particular way that made the walk down to it in the mornings one of the sharper physical experiences of frontier living. Thomas Lincoln had acquired the farm the previous year, paying $200 for approximately 348 acres, a price that reflected both the ambition and the limited financial position of a working carpenter and small farmer in a territory that had achieved statehood only 17 years earlier. The cabin he had built on this land stood in a clearing some distance from the spring, and was a single room of roughly 16 feet by 18 feet, constructed of hewn logs sealed with mud chinking, with a packed dirt floor, a stone fireplace on one end wall, and a single window opening covered in oiled animal skin rather than glass, because glass in a frontier cabin was both expensive and difficult to obtain. It was in this room, on February 12, 1809, that Abraham Lincoln was born. The room itself is the right place to begin, because it is the first in a recurring set of physical spaces, rooms, houses, corridors, offices, that shaped Lincoln's life in ways that simple biography rarely emphasizes. The first room was not a place of comfort or privacy in any modern sense of those words. It had no internal divisions, no partition between sleeping and waking spaces, no separation between the domestic labor that took place near the hearth and the rest of life that happened within the same four walls. Thomas and Nancy Lincoln slept in one area. Their older daughter, Sarah, born 2 years earlier, slept in another. The family's cooking, their limited social exchange with neighbors, and whatever small activities passed for leisure in the shortened winter days all occurred within the same enclosure of roughly 288 square feet. Thomas Lincoln occupies a complicated position in the story of his son's early life, and the historical record on him has been shaped in part by William Henry Herndon's interviews with those who remembered him, interviews conducted decades after the fact, filtered through particular perspectives of frontier neighbors who had their own reasons for speaking as they did. What the record does support is a portrait of a man who was intermittently employed, who moved frequently in response to legal disputes over land titles, and who possessed a craftsman's skill with wood that his son would later recall with a degree of precision suggesting it had made a lasting impression. Thomas Lincoln built furniture as well as structures. He was a member of the Little Mount Separate Baptist Church in Kentucky, a congregation with a documented anti-slavery position that was not unusual among a certain strand of frontier Baptist practice in that era. He stood approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall, was described by those who knew him as a man of modest conversational gifts, and appears to have approached life with a temperamental steadiness that served him well against the persistent reversals of frontier circumstance, but that his more intellectually restless son would later describe, in document Herndon preserved, with a kind of measured and quiet distance. Nancy Hanks Lincoln is harder to recover from the historical record, for reasons that are partly circumstantial and partly reflective of the way that women of limited means on the frontier were documented, which is to say, imperfectly and often only through the recollections of those who outlived them by many decades. She was born around 1784, though the exact date remains uncertain, to a family whose own origins were the subject of some ambiguity in her own lifetime. She could read, which placed her above a portion of the surrounding population in that time and place, though the extent of her literary education is not established with confidence. Those who recalled her in later years, and it must be acknowledged that those recollections came after her son, have become one of the most widely known men in American history, which necessarily shaped the way people chose to describe her, spoke of a woman of quiet thoughtfulness, of some intelligence, and of a physical resemblance to the son who would grow to tower over nearly every room he ever entered. The family did not remain at Sinking Spring Farm. In the spring of 1811, when Abraham was 2 years old, Thomas Lincoln moved the family to a farm at Knob Creek, a few miles to the northeast in what is now LaRue County, and this property, a narrow strip of bottomland along the creek, amounting to approximately 228 acres, became the landscape of Lincoln's first conscious memories. He recalled, in an 1858 autobiographical note, that his earliest clear recollection was of the Knob Creek Farm, which he described briefly as a place of small fields and water. The cabin at Knob Creek was similar in construction to the one at Sinking Spring, a single room, a hearth, the same essential architectural equation of family life, compressed into one shared space, though the land around it was more cultivated and the community of neighbors somewhat denser than it had been on the more isolated farm to the southwest. Abraham and his sister Sarah attended a subscription school conducted by Zachariah Riney and later by Caleb Hazel, institutions that met irregularly, charged parents a small fee per term, and operated on the blab school method, meaning students read their lessons aloud simultaneously, to demonstrate by sheer volume that they were engaged with material. The Knob Creek years came to an end in the winter of 1816, when Thomas Lincoln made the decision to move the family across the Ohio River into Indiana, a decision driven in significant part by the persistent instability of Kentucky's land title system, which operated on the basis of treasury warrants that could produce overlapping and competing claims on the same property, and which had already cost Thomas Lincoln considerable legal difficulty on the Sinking Spring Farm. Indiana had been surveyed under the federal land ordinance system, which meant that property boundaries were recorded with greater precision and legal claims were more straightforward to establish and defend. Thomas Lincoln crossed the Ohio with his family in December that year, making a journey of some miles through heavily forested terrain in Spencer County, Indiana, during winter conditions that the historical record does not describe in close detail, but that Lincoln's own later references to the period suggest were physically demanding in ways he did not forget. The first structure the family occupied in Indiana was what contemporaries called a half-face camp. 3 walls and a roof, open on one side to a fire, kept burning through the night for warmth against a Spencer County winter. This was shelter in the most provisional sense, barely more than a defined space against the cold, and the family lived in it for several weeks before Thomas Lincoln could complete a proper one-room cabin on the new property near Pigeon Creek. The architecture of the half-face camp, if the word architecture can be applied to so rudimentary construction, represented the lowest point in the physical circumstances of Lincoln's early childhood, a spatial existence that offered no separation from the elements, no privacy, no thermal comfort beyond the immediate radius of the fire. It was a kind of dwelling that left its marks not necessarily as a conscious memory, but as a physical reference point. The body learns what cold and extended exposure actually mean in a way that later warmth cannot entirely erase. It was at the Pigeon Creek Farm that Nancy Hanks Lincoln died on October 5, 1818. Abraham was 9 years old. The illness that killed her was called milk sickness in the language of the region, and it came from drinking milk produced by cows that had grazed on white snakeroot, a plant containing the toxin trematol, which accumulates in dairy products and produces, in human beings who consume them over time, a progressive and painful illness characterized by weakness, severe nausea, a distinctive trembling of the limbs, and eventual organ failure. The disease moved to the Pigeon Creek settlement that autumn, killing several neighbors as well as the Lincoln family's close friends Peter Brunner and Betsy Brunner within the same few weeks. Thomas Lincoln built the coffin from green lumber, cutting the boards himself from timber felled on the property. The grave was placed on a rise in the woods above the cabin, and it remained there, unmarked by any formal stone for several years, while the household below it continued its life under the altered conditions that follow a death at the center of a small domestic space. Dennis Hanks, a cousin of Nancy Lincoln who was living with the family at the time and who was, at 19, roughly 10 years older than Abraham, later gave William Henry Herndon one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the months that followed Nancy's death. By Hanks's description, the family situation in the autumn and winter of 1818 was one of genuine material precariousness that went beyond the ordinary difficulties of frontier life. Thomas Lincoln was farming land that had not yet been fully cleared. Sarah Lincoln, who was 12 years old at the time of her mother's death, assumed the domestic responsibilities of the household with an abruptness that the record notes without elaborating. Abraham, according to Hanks, became quieter than he had been, more given to sitting apart from the family's regular activities, more frequently found a book or a stick of charcoal and a flat surface on which to practice letters. Hanks's accounts, filtered as they are through decades of retrospective recollection and through the obvious pressure being a primary source of the biography of a martyred president, require careful handling, but they are the most immediate record available for those particular months, and they remain consistent enough in their basic outline to carry evidential weight. Thomas Lincoln returned to Kentucky the following year and came back to Pigeon Creek in December of 1819 with a new wife, Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow from Elizabethtown with 3 children of her own, Elizabeth Johnston, Matilda Johnston, and John Daniel Johnston. She came with furniture, a bureau, a table, a set of chairs, and cookware sufficient for a household of real size. These objects are worth pausing on because they represent something more than domestic inventory. Into a one-room log cabin that had spent 14 months housing 4 people in conditions of notable material scarcity, Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln brought the physical markers of a household that aspired to a particular kind of order, objects that declared, in the mute language of furniture, that the people living among them expected a degree of permanence and a degree of comfort. She also brought, according to virtually every account that survives, something less tangible but no less significant, a consistent, undemonstrative warmth toward her stepchildren that Abraham Lincoln carried forward as a reference point for maternal care for the remainder of his life. Lincoln wrote of Sarah Bush Johnston Lincoln in his 1860 autobiography prepared for campaign purposes that she had proved a good and kind mother, and he spoke to Herndon in later decades with a degree of feeling on the subject that Herndon recorded with evident care. Lincoln reportedly described his stepmother to Herndon as his best friend in this world, and the consistency of this sentiment across various recorded conversations suggests it was not a polished public sentiment, but a private conviction that had simply been present long enough to become settled. The room she entered in December of 1819 was the same one-room log cabin it had always been, the same dimensions, the same packed earth underfoot, but the domestic atmosphere within it shifted in ways that both Dennis Hanks and Lincoln himself, speaking from the far distance of adulthood, consistently acknowledged. The education Lincoln received in Indiana was fragmentary and brief. He attended schools taught by Andrew Crawford and then by Asa Waters Dorsey, blab schools of the same informal kind he had known in Kentucky, but the combined total of his formal schooling, by his own accounting in the 1858 autobiographical note, amounted to less than 12 months accumulated across several scattered years. What he learned beyond that, he largely taught himself by reading whatever came within reach. A family Bible, Noah Webster's American Spelling Book, John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, Aesop's Fables, and later William Grimshaw's History of the United States, among other volumes that passed to the household or were borrowed from neighbors. The firelight by which he read in the evenings was the primary technology of his self-education, and neighbors who visited the cabin in those years later recalled seeing him lying on the wooden floor near the hearth, his feet elevated against the wall, working through a page by whatever light the fire could provide. The physical labor of frontier life ran in constant parallel to this private intellectual effort, without interrupting it. But it was real and unceasing and shaped the body that would later stand behind a lectern in the Illinois state legislature and then in the halls of the United States Congress. Lincoln split rails, cleared timber, tended crops, and hired out his labor to neighbors, a common practice under which the wages he earned went by legal convention not to him but to his father, because he had not yet reached 21 years of age, the legal threshold for independence. He worked fields and flatboats in neighbors' properties across Indiana and into the early years of his time in Illinois. And this labor marked him physically in ways that remained visible for decades afterward. His grip, noted by those who shook his hand during the White House years, was the grip of a man who had spent formative years with an axe and had never entirely lost a physical record of it. The Indiana years ended in March of 1830, when Thomas Lincoln moved the family again, this time to Macon County, Illinois, following a count of fertile land and a milder climate that had reached him through other settlers moving through the region. Abraham Lincoln was 21 years old and legally his own man, no longer obligated to deliver his labor's wages to his father's household. He helped build a cabin on the new property, split fence rails through that first Illinois season, a detail that would later acquire a mythological weight in his political career that the original act had not possessed in any way he could have foreseen, and then, in the following year, began the process of separating himself from the household of his father and stepmother in a way that turned out, in practice, to be permanent. He would visit Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln again on several occasions over the following decades, and she would outlive him. He would not live again in any structure resembling the ones that had shaped his first 21 years. But those structures had done their work. The one-room cabin at Sinking Spring Farm, the similar construction at Knob Creek, the half-face camp in Spencer County, the Pigeon Creek property where Nancy Lincoln died, and where Sarah Bush Johnson Lincoln had arrived with her bureau and her chairs. These spaces were the architectural facts of Lincoln's formation, the physical conditions inside which his mind had assembled itself. His character had taken its early shape, and his relationship to solitude, to the interior life, and to the particular quality of silence that comes from having no room of one's own had first been established. The first rooms left no written record in Lincoln's own hand, but they left their record in everything that came after. Lincoln called it the hypo. The term was drawn from the medical vocabulary of the early 19th century, in which hypochondria did not carry its modern meaning of imagined or exaggerated physical complaints, but described instead a genuine and recognized state of profound melancholy, a heaviness of spirit that could settle without requiring a specific external cause, and that resisted, in the experience of those who knew it with any intimacy, most of the ordinary means by which human beings attempt to raise themselves. Clear of interior darkness, Lincoln used the word with the flat familiarity of a man naming a weather pattern he had learned to anticipate and endure, rather than one he had ever expected to simply outlast. The condition was present in some form from relatively early in his adult life, though the written record on this point grows substantially thicker only from the mid-1830s onward. Lincoln had been living in New Salem, a small village on the Sangamon River in central Illinois, since the summer of 1831, working first as a store clerk, and then as a postmaster, and then as a deputy surveyor, studying law from borrowed books, absorbing the social texture of a community that, at its peak, housed no more than approximately 150 people in a scatter of cabins and commercial buildings along a single main road. It was in this compressed social world that he encountered a young woman named in Rutledge, the daughter of James Rutledge, one of the village's founders, who had also established a tavern that functioned as a boarding house and gathering point for New Salem's residents. And Rutledge died of typhoid fever on August 25th, 1835, at approximately 22 years of age, and the question of what she meant to Abraham Lincoln has occupied a significant portion of biographical effort over the following century and a half. William Henry Herndon, who conducted extensive interviews with New Salem residents after Lincoln's assassination, gathered testimony from multiple sources suggesting that Lincoln and Rutledge had formed a romantic attachment, that Lincoln had courted her, that she had consented to an understanding between them, and that her death had placed Lincoln in a state of grief so acute that his neighbors had grown genuinely concerned for his stability. mentor Graham, who had taught Lincoln grammar and the rudiments of surveying during the New Salem years, and who remained a reliable correspondent for Herndon's later inquiry, was among those who described Lincoln's condition in the autumn of 1835 as markedly distressed, and the particular detail that recurs most persistently in the New Salem testimony is that Lincoln had to be watched, that the people around him felt they could not safely leave him alone with himself for extended periods. The historical difficulty is that all of this testimony was gathered in the middle 1860s, 30 years after the events it describes, and it was gathered from people who knew, by that point, that the man they were discussing had become the martyred president. The human memory does not operate neutrally under those conditions, and later scholars, working with more systematic attention to what the documentary record can and cannot support, have found the romantic dimension of the Rutledge story considerably less certain than Herndon's interviews implied. What the record does support, with reasonable confidence, is that Lincoln experienced a significant episode of depressive collapse in the period following Rutledge's death, that this episode was visible to those around him, and that the particular quality of his grief, whatever its precise origin, established in the minds of his New Salem neighbors a clear impression of a man whose emotional depths were both real and capable of expressing themselves in ways that temporarily overran his capacity for ordinary self-management. By 1837, Lincoln had moved to Springfield, which had just been designated as the new capital of Illinois, and which was drawing lawyers, politicians, and merchants in sufficient numbers to generate the kind of professional and social density that Lincoln's ambitions required. He arrived at the dry goods store operated by Joshua Fry Speed at the corner of 5th Street and Washington Street, asked the price of a single bed, calculated that he could not afford it, and Speed, by his own later account, simply offered him half of the large room on the upper floor of the building, an offer that Lincoln accepted on the spot, and that initiated a friendship of an intimacy that was, in mid-19th century terms, neither unusual nor remarkable between men of that era, but that remains one of the most fully documented close relationships of Lincoln's adult life. They shared that room for nearly 4 years, from 1837 until Speed returned to Kentucky in 1841, and the particular character of the space matters in the context of Lincoln's interior life. It was not a private room in any modern sense, but it was a shared domestic space removed from the public commercial activity of the store below, a place where the two men read and talked after the working day, where Lincoln spread his law books across the floor in his characteristic manner and worked through cases by lamplight, and where the kind of conversation that requires proximity and continuity could develop its full texture across the long evenings of a shared domestic arrangement. Speed observed Lincoln across those years with an attention that was both affectionate and precise, and his later recollections, conveyed through correspondence with Herndon and through direct interview, provide some of the most detailed first-hand testimony available on the interior Lincoln of the late 1830s. The room above Speed's store was, in this sense, one of the most consequential private spaces in Lincoln's life, not because anything dramatic occurred within it, but because it was the first space in Lincoln's adult experience that approximated a private life conducted in consistent proximity to a trusted other person. The winter of 1840 to 1841 brought the most severe episode of Lincoln's depressive history that is fully documented in the written record, and arrived in a period already complicated by a personal situation that had not resolved itself to anyone's satisfaction, including his own. He had been engaged in some form to Mary Todd, who had been living in Springfield since late 1839 at the home of her sister Elizabeth Todd Edwards and her brother-in-law Ninian Wirt Edwards, a prominent figure in Illinois state politics. The engagement had been troubled from its inception, passing through periods of uncertain progress and apparent withdrawal on Lincoln's part, and whatever happened in the specific days around the 1st of January, 1841. Lincoln referred to that date in subsequent correspondence simply as a fatal first, without further elaboration that the surviving letters preserve. It produced a rupture whose precise nature the record does not clarify, beyond the fact of its occurrence and its evidence of verity. On January 23, 1841, Lincoln wrote to John Todd Stewart, who was then serving in the United States Congress in Washington, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on the earth." He continued by noting that whether he would ever feel better, he could not say, and that he had not been attending to business for several days. The letter is brief, and its language is stripped of the rhetorical elaboration that characterized most of Lincoln's written communication, which gives it the particular quality of something produced at the outer edge of a person's capacity for composition, a document written not to persuade or explain, but simply to transmit the fact or condition in the plainest available terms. Speed, who was still sharing a room above the store with Lincoln during this period, later told Herndon that he had, at some point during this crisis, removed a pocket knife from Lincoln's possession out of concern for what Lincoln might do with it, and that Lincoln had been confined largely to his room for several days and attended by his personal physician, Anson Gordon Henry. Henry was a doctor who had settled in Springfield in the early 1830s and who occupied, in Lincoln's social world, a position that combined medical care with genuine personal friendship of a kind that Lincoln, for reasons connected to his own emotional reserve, formed slowly and preserved carefully. Henry's practical involvement during the 1841 crisis, his physical presence at the bedside, his monitoring of a man he knew to be at a genuinely dangerous point, represent one of the more intimate moments in the documentary record of Lincoln's private life, conducted entirely within a confined space, a room above a store on a winter street in Springfield, Illinois. Lincoln recovered from the episode over the following weeks, not through any single intervention, but through the gradual reassertion of his own capacity for activity, work, and the various psychological management strategies he had been assembling, with varying degrees of conscious deliberateness, since his earliest encounters with the condition. What those strategies look like in practice, and what they reveal about the interior structure of his mind, is worth examining with some care, because they persisted across the remaining decades of his life and ultimately shaped the way he functioned under the most severe pressures any holder of his office had yet been required to endure. Chief among those strategies was reading. Lincoln's relationship with books was not casual or incidental, but sustained and deliberate, a relationship with texts he selected for reasons the record occasionally makes explicit. He loved Robert Burns above almost all other poets, and quoted him frequently in letters, conversations, and speeches across his entire adult life. The Scottish vernacular of Burns's verse apparently carrying a particular resonance for a man who had come out of Scots-Irish frontier heritage, even though his own formal connection to that heritage was attenuated by 2 generations of American migration. He loved William Shakespeare with a depth that was practical as well as aesthetic. He knew the tragedies at a level of detailed familiarity that allowed him to catch actors who misquoted or transposed lines during performances, and he told the actor James Henry Hackett in a letter written in August of 1863 they had gone through some of Shakespeare's plays, naming Macbeth, Richard III, Henry VIII, Hamlet, and several of the histories, perhaps as frequently as any non-professional reader in America. The conditional phrasing in that sentence is characteristic Lincoln, and it was precisely accurate. He was not performing modesty, but describing the scope of his engagement with a text in terms that preserved the possibility of being wrong. He also loved a poem that he recited from memory throughout his adult life, with a frequency that multiple associates recorded as remarkable even for a man of his evident fondness for verse. The poem begins with the line, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" It was written by William Knox, a Scottish poet who had lived from 1789 to 1825. Lincoln sometimes attributed it to Thomas Hood, the English poet, or to other authors, which reflects the imprecise circulation of printed material in that period, but the authorship is established. He told several people, on separate recorded occasions, that he would give everything he was worth to have written it himself, a statement that, from a man who did not speak about money or possessions with any extravagance, carries some weight as an index of feeling. The poem meditates on mortality and the leveling passage of time with a directness and a certain wintry calm that made it a natural habitation for a mind that had been in close contact with death from the age of 9 and that had continued to experience loss in the years since. That Lincoln would have memorized it, carried it in his mental inventory, and returned to it throughout his life is entirely consistent with what the record shows of the uses to which he put his reading generally. Reading operated in Lincoln's psychological economy as a form of interior architecture. It built a private space that existed independently of whatever room or building he happened to occupy, and was accessible to him in conditions that offered very little in the way of physical privacy or sustained quiet. Frontier cabins, circuit court taverns, the crowded domestic spaces of a family with young children, and eventually the besieged offices of a wartime presidency. The books he carried, and the passages he memorized constituted a portable enclosure that he could enter at a level of inwardness that his surroundings could not provide in any physical sense. His law partner William Henry Herndon, who worked alongside Lincoln for 16 years in their shared office on the public square in Springfield, observed this quality directly and recorded it with precision. Lincoln would sometimes read aloud to himself in a low voice, a habit that Herndon found distracting, but that Lincoln maintained without apology, explaining that he retained material better when it passed through his ear as well as his eye. That explanation is both a description of a specific reading strategy and an accidental self-portrait of a man who had been educated by the spoken word before he was educated by the written one, and who had never entirely separated the two. The other major management strategy was humor. Lincoln's storytelling and his capacity for comedy, for the particular kind of slow, elaborately constructed anecdote that builds toward a conclusion over the course of several minutes, was documented by virtually everyone who spent significant time in his company, and it was recognized by those closest to him as serving a function that was not merely social. Speed observed that the storytelling almost always intensified in periods when Lincoln's spirits were lowest, and that it seemed to produce a genuine, if temporary, relief. That Lincoln himself appeared measurably lighter after a long session of stories than before it, regardless of the size or responsiveness of his audience. Herndon made similar observations in his own notes on Lincoln's office behavior. The humor was not an alternative to melancholy, but a response to it. A regularly applied pressure release mechanism that Lincoln used with the same unsentimental consistency with which a man in a cold climate keeps would stack near the door. Walking served a related and distinct function. Lincoln walked with the habitual regularity of a man who understood the connection between physical movement and mental equilibrium, without having any theoretical framework in which to articulate that understanding. In Springfield, he was a familiar figure on the streets in the early morning and late evening, moving at a pace that those who accompanied him sometimes found difficult to match given the length of his stride, and in a posture that was slightly forward-leaning, his hands either clasped behind his back or thrust into his coat pockets, his head inclined in a way that suggested active internal occupation rather than idle exercise. These daily passages through the streets of the city he knew intimately were not simply physical activity in any narrow sense. They were a form of managed solitude, a means of being temporarily neither at a desk nor in a room with other people, moving through a space without being obligated to it. The interior life Lincoln built across the 1830s and 1840s was not a serene or settled thing. It was an ongoing negotiation between a genuine and recurring darkness and the various means he had assembled for continuing to function within it. Reading, storytelling, walking, friendship, and the sustained application of a formidable intellect to problems of law and politics that gave his days their organizing structure. What it was not, exactly, was secret. Those who knew him well enough saw it clearly, and those who did not know him well noticed the occasional surface irregularity without understanding its source. What it was private, held within the boundaries of a few close relationships, and expressed in writing only when circumstances drove it to the surface. That private interiority would not diminish in the years ahead, but it would be compelled, by the changed conditions of Lincoln's life, to inhabit an entirely different kind of architecture, and the first of those new structures was already waiting for him, in the form of a house on 8th Street in Springfield, and the marriage that would define it. Mary Todd was born in Lexington, Kentucky, on December 13, 1818, the third child of Robert Smith Todd and Eliza Parker Todd, in a household that occupied a position of genuine social prominence in a city that was then one of the more cultivated towns in the American interior. Lexington had, by the early decades of the 19th century, acquired a university, several newspapers, maintained public streets, and a social culture sufficiently developed to sustain formal domestic entertainment of the kind that required servants, adequate rooms, and the material resources to furnish them properly. Robert Smith Todd was a banker, merchant, and state legislator of sufficient standing that the family's house on Main Street was among the better appointed residences in a city that took some notice of such things. Mary grew up in a domestic space categorically different in scale, function, and social expectation from the one-room log structures that had shaped the first years of the man she would eventually marry. Her mother, Eliza Parker Todd, died in July of 1825, when Mary was 6 years old, and her father's subsequent remarriage to Elizabeth Humphreys produced a blended household of some complexity that Mary, by the accounts available in her own later correspondence, experienced with something less than unqualified ease. Her education was arranged with the seriousness that the Todd social position and Robert Smith Todd's particular regard for female accomplishment could support. She attended the academy run by Reverend John Ward in Lexington, and then boarded for approximately 4 years at the school operated by Victoire Charlotte Leclerc Mentel and her husband Augustus Waldemar Mentel, an institution of local distinction where the curriculum included French, which Mary spoke with proficiency she maintained throughout her adult life, as well as literature, dancing, drawing, and the social arts expected of a young woman of her background and prospects. By the time she left the Mentel School, Mary Todd possessed an education that was, by the standards of the 1830s and by the standards of any gender or class, notably comprehensive. She arrived in Springfield, Illinois, in the late autumn of 1839, traveling from Lexington to stay with her older sister Elizabeth Todd Edwards and Elizabeth's husband Ninian Wirt Edwards, who lived in one of the more substantial houses in Springfield and who moved in the uppermost stratum of the city's small but self-conscious social world. Mary Todd at 20 was intellectually confident, conversationally quick, and politically informed in ways unusual for a woman of that era. Her father's political connections had made the machinery of public life a familiar subject at the family table, and she possessed a social ambition that was not merely personal vanity, but a genuine strategic appetite for the larger stage that public prominence could provide. The contrast between her background and that of Abraham Lincoln, who by the time she arrived in Springfield had been practicing law and serving in the state legislature for several years, was considerable and was not unnoticed by either party or by the observing Springfield community around them. The precise circumstances of their meeting are not established with certainty in the documentary record, though the most commonly cited accounts place it at a social gathering in the winter of 1839 to 1840. What the letters and the later testimony do support is that the attraction between them was genuine, that it was also complicated from a relatively early point by a mismatch in temperament and in certain social expectations, and that the courtship moved through a period of considerable uncertainty before arriving at its eventual resolution. Mary wrote to her friend Mercy and Levering in December of 1840 in terms that described Lincoln's hold on her emotional attention as something she found both compelling and difficult to account for, noting that he had, in her experience, the quality of directing all his hopes and intentions toward a single object, a description that captures something real about Lincoln's particular brand of intensity and about its effect on those who were the object of it. The engagement, such as it was, did not proceed smoothly. Whatever transpired in the days surrounding the 1st of January, 1841, the fatal first, as Lincoln referred to it in subsequent correspondence, without elaborating beyond that compressed description, it produced a separation that lasted for the better part of 2 years, during which Lincoln's depressive crisis moved through its most acute phase, and both parties conducted their separate lives in the same city without, apparently, a great deal of direct communication. The reconciliation, when it came, was reportedly facilitated in part by Eliza Francis, the wife of Simeon Francis, who edited the Sangamo Journal in Springfield, and who is said to have arranged social occasions at which Lincoln and Mary Todd were both present without prior notice of the other's attendance, a piece of deliberate social architecture that the later accounts preserve with enough consistency to suggest some basis, in fact, even if the specific details have been simplified in the telling. Whether the reconciliation was as engineered as those accounts suggest, or whether it was a more gradual and mutual process that the story is compressed in retrospect, the result was clear. On the evening of November 4th, 1842, Abraham Lincoln and Mary Todd were married at the home of Ninian and Elizabeth Edwards in a ceremony conducted by Reverend Charles Dresser of St. Paul's Episcopal Church, with a small number of guests and apparently very little advance notice, given even to those who attended. The wedding was not an elaborately planned occasion. The notice was sufficiently short. Some accounts suggest Lincoln and Mary Todd decided to proceed with only a day or two of preparation, that the gathering at the Edward house had something of the quality of a hastily convened domestic event rather than a formal social ceremony. Lincoln reportedly told the assembled guests, when someone observed that he appeared to be going to heaven, that he could not be entirely certain the destination was correct, a remark whose dry self-deprecation was characteristic, and that tells, in its small way, something about the emotional register in which he approached even the most consequential moments of his private life. The first home the married Lincolns occupied was not a house in any sense that offered the domestic privacy or spatial organization that the word implies. The Globe Tavern on Adams Street in Springfield was a two-story frame boarding house that provided room and board for travelers and for residents who had not yet established permanent household of their own, at a cost of $4 per week for a room and meals taken in the common dining room downstairs. The Lincolns occupied a single room on the upper floor. Below them, the daily operations of the tavern continued. Other boarders, passing travelers, the noise and smell of a public commercial establishment that had not been designed to the privacy of its occupants as a primary consideration, and the meals that constituted a significant portion of domestic social life in the 1840s were taken at a common table with whoever else happened to be in residence. It was in this single room above a public boarding house that Mary Todd Lincoln, on August 1st, 1843, gave birth to the couple's first child, Robert Todd Lincoln. The Globe Tavern room was, in the architecture of Lincoln's private life, a peculiar intermediate space, more physically enclosed than the shared room above Speed's store had been, but less private than either because it existed within a commercial building whose operations the Lincolns could hear and smell, but could not modify or control. Mary Todd, who had grown up in a substantial house in Lexington with servants and separate rooms for separate purposes, was now conducting her domestic life in a single room in a boarding house on a main street in Springfield, and the adjustment this required was presumably considerable, though the surviving record does not preserve her direct commentary on the Globe Tavern years in any sustained detail. What it does preserve is the fact that the arrangement lasted approximately 1 year before Lincoln made the purchase that established the more durable spatial conditions of the family's life together. In May of 1844, Lincoln purchased from Reverend Charles Dresser, the same minister who had married them less than 2 years earlier, a 1.5-story Greek revival cottage at the corner of 8th Street and Jackson Street in Springfield, paying $1,500 for property. The house had 5 rooms across its 2 levels, a kitchen, and a yard of sufficient size to keep a cow, which the family did in the early years. It stood on a lot that was neither the grandest nor the most modest in its immediate neighborhood, in a part of Springfield that was residential without being conspicuously fashionable, the kind of address appropriate to a rising lawyer and former state legislator. Precise enough in its social positioning that it communicated something clear to Springfield's community of observers without announcing ambitions beyond what the current circumstances could sustain. Mary Todd Lincoln would live in this house for 17 years, managing it, furnishing it, and overseeing its significant expansion in 1856 and 1857, when it was renovated into a full 2-story structure with 12 rooms. But in 1844, when the family moved in from the Globe Tavern with their infant son, it was a modest and serviceable frame cottage in which the domestic life of the Lincoln marriage began in earnest. The dynamics of that marriage, as they are recoverable from the historical record, have been documented with uneven generosity toward both parties. William Henry Herndon, whose access to Lincoln's daily life across 16 years of shared law practice made him an important primary source, bore a documented and admitted personal hostility toward Mary Todd Lincoln that colors his testimony on the marriage with a bias sufficiently obvious that even careful historians who rely on his other observations tend to footnote his remarks about Mrs. Lincoln with appropriate reservation. What can be said, drawing from the fuller range of sources? Mary's own correspondence, the account of neighbors, the letters of friends including Orville Hickman Browning and his wife Eliza, and Lincoln's own letters to Mary during his periods of absence, is that the marriage was between 2 people of strong and quite different temperaments who had chosen each other deliberately and who sustained their union across 22 years in the face of difficulties that would have dissolved many. Partnerships, though not without what the letters and testimony suggest, was a persistent undercurrent of friction running beneath the periods of evident mutual understanding and affection. Mary Todd Lincoln's temper was documented by multiple sources with enough consistency across enough independent accounts that it cannot be attributed entirely to Herndon's personal animus or to the era's general tendency to find fault with women who express strong emotion with directness. She was volatile in ways that Lincoln's household staff, their neighbors, and her own letters describe with varying degrees of discretion. She was also, by the evidence of those same letters, a woman of considerable intellectual engagement, deep political instinct, and a capacity for loyalty and affection that the public memory of her temperament has sometimes obscured. Lincoln's own letters to her during his absences on the 8th Judicial Circuit are notably warm and attentive. He wrote asking after the boys, reporting on conditions in the towns he was passing through, expressing in terms that were not elaborate, but that were consistent the attachment of a man who thought about the people waiting at home with a regularity that a professional focus had not displaced. Those absences were a structural fact of the marriage that the physical house on 8th Street encodes in its own particular way. Lincoln was away on the circuit, a roughly 300-mile loop to the counties of central and eastern Illinois, for months of every year across the 1840s and into the 1850s, sometimes returning to Springfield for brief intervals and then leaving again, and sometimes remaining away for the full duration of a circuit term that could extend to 12 weeks or more. In his absence, the house on 8th and Jackson was entirely Mary's domain. She managed the domestic staff, oversaw the household finances, made decisions about the children's activities and education, dealt with the physical maintenance of the property, and maintained the family social position in a community that observed the Lincoln household's progress with the interested attention that a relatively small city directs toward its more visible members. The house was simultaneously Lincoln's home and, for extended periods, effectively Mary's alone, a spatial arrangement that placed the weight of daily domestic management entirely on one member of the partnership, while the other traveled the legal circuit and earned the income that was making all of it possible. Their 4 sons occupied the house in progressively overlapping succession. Robert Todd Lincoln, born August 1st, 1843, was the eldest and by most accounts the most self-contained of the 4, a boy who appeared to draw the least of his father's daily attention, partly by temperament and partly by the circumstance of his birth order, which placed him in the household before his father's particular style of parenting had fully revealed itself. Edward Baker Lincoln, called Eddie, was born on March 10, 1846, and died on February 1st, 1850, 3 days before his 4th birthday, of a prolonged illness presenting as a wasting fever, most likely tuberculosis in the assessment of subsequent medical analysis, though consumption was a word those around him used. His dying lasted nearly 2 months, during which the house on 8th Street held a failing child and his parents in particular suspended condition that a prolonged childhood illness creates in a household. The ordinary routines of domestic life continuing in adjacent rooms, while the central fact of the house redirected every available attention toward a single small bed. Mary Todd Lincoln's response to Eddie's death was a grief of extended intensity that alarmed those around her, and that marked the before and after in her emotional biography. The letters she wrote in the period following his death show not the formal Victorian language of mourning that the conventions of the period prescribed, but a rawer and more prolonged private suffering that the prescribed forms were insufficient to contain. Lincoln's own grief was less demonstrably expressed in the documentary record, but the period following Eddie's death coincides with a return of the melancholy that those who knew Lincoln well would have recognized. The house on 8th Street, which had been for 6 years the site of the ordinary and sometimes turbulent domestic life of a growing family, had now also become the site of a child's death, a layer of meaning added to the domestic space that neither of its occupants could set aside, and that each would carry in their own way through the years that followed. Less than 10 months after Eddie died, on December 21st, 1850, Mary Todd Lincoln gave birth to William Wallace Lincoln, the child who would come to be called Willie, and who would grow into a son in whom both parents found the deepest reflection of their own most appealing qualities. Thomas Lincoln, called Tad from his infancy because of a head shape his father compared to that of a tadpole, followed on April 4th, 1853. The house on 8th Street was full again with the noise of young children, and it would remain so through the decade that preceded the presidency, a decade in which Lincoln's legal practice reached its professional height, in which his political ambitions were gathering toward direction that the previous years had not yet made clear, and in which the rooms of the house on 8th and Jackson Street remained the fixed point around which a life of increasing consequence continued to quietly organize itself. The house that occupied the lot at the corner of 8th Street and Jackson Street sat on a parcel of approximately 52 by 162 feet, and the building that stood on it by the mid-1850s, after the renovation of 1856 and 1857, had transformed the original 1.5-story cottage into a full 2-story frame structure of 12 rooms, communicated something specific and legible to the Springfield community that passed it daily. that the man who lived was doing sufficiently well to expand his dwelling, was not so prosperous as to move to a grander address, and was maintaining with deliberate care the outward signals appropriate to a successful lawyer who was beginning, by that point, to attract political attention that reached beyond the state's borders. Mary Todd Lincoln had overseen the renovation in its practical details while her husband was away on the legal circuit, and the story preserved in several later accounts. That Lincoln arrived home to find the transformation nearly complete, looked at the house from the street, and remarked with dry bewilderment that he was looking for a man who lived here, is consistent enough across its various tellings, and consistent enough with Lincoln's established habit of converting domestic surprise into an anecdote before the surprise had finished resolving itself, to carry some basis in actual occurrence. The renovation cost approximately $1,300 for its core structural work, with additional expenditures for furnishing and finishing the new rooms, and it was financed by the improved income that Lincoln's legal practice had generated across the previous decade. The interior that resulted reflected Mary Todd Lincoln's taste and her precise understanding of what a Springfield household, at their social position, should project to those admitted within it. The front parlor, the room through which visitors passed first and which carried the greatest social weight in the domestic culture of that era, was furnished with a horsehair sofa, side chairs, a marble-top center table, and wallpaper that several contemporaries described as a rich brown pattern, a choice that produced warmth without moving into anything that a Springfield observer of the 1850s would have characterized as excess. The back parlor was arranged for less formal family use, and the piano that Mary Todd Lincoln kept there was not a decorative object, but a regularly played one. She had been trained in music at the Mentel School in Lexington and brought a genuine competence to the instrument that guests noted with consistency. Beyond the parlors, the dining room was organized with formal entertaining that Lincoln's growing political prominence made increasingly frequent, and the kitchen at the rear of the house was a functional center of the household's daily operations, the room from which the domestic labor that sustained all of it proceeded under whatever combination of paid assistance and personal management the household was running at any given time. Upstairs, the bedrooms were distributed across the second story in an arrangement suited to a family with children of varying ages and domestic needs. The room that Lincoln and Mary Todd Lincoln shared faced the street, and its windows looked southeast onto the intersection that had been visible from their property for 17 years. The boys had their own rooms, and Robert Todd Lincoln, the eldest, occupied a room that reflected his somewhat more self-contained domestic habits. A boy who, by the accounts of those who visited the house, moved to the family's domestic space with a reserve that set him apart from his younger brothers in ways that would have been evident to any observer spending even a short time in the household. The yard at the rear of the house contained a privy, a carriage house, a stable, and in the earlier years a small enclosure where the Lincolns kept a cow. Lincoln himself milked the cow on mornings when the domestic arrangements required it, and James Gorley, who lived immediately adjacent to the Lincoln property on the south side of the lot, and who observed the household's daily operations with the careful attention of a neighbor in close proximity, reported to William Henry Herndon that the sight of Lincoln crossing the yard perform this task in his shirt sleeves was a common enough morning occurrence to have long since ceased to be remarkable. Gorley's testimony to Herndon constitutes one of the most detailed available records of Lincoln's domestic behavior, and it is particularly valuable because Gorley observed him not in the public or professional context in which most accounts of Lincoln originate, but in the unrehearsed and physically specific context of a yard, a fence line, and the ordinary domestic operations of adjacent households going about their daily business. Gorley told Herndon that Lincoln was a man who answered his own front door, who carried his own marketing when the morning's domestic logistics required it, who appeared at the fence to discuss political developments with the engaged but unhurried attention of a man who had thought about these matters and was interested in thinking about them further. He noted that Lincoln was what he called a very domestic man, who loved his home, and that this love expressed itself not to the kind of formal domestic management that might be expected of a man of Lincoln's standing, but through a genuine ease within the household's physical spaces that suggested someone who was genuinely comfortable in the daily material life of the house, not merely tolerating it as an interval between more significant engagements. The children shaped that domestic space with an energy that multiple observers recorded with a combination of affection and barely restrained comment. Willie and Tad Lincoln moved to the house and yard with freedom from parental restraint that was, by the standards of Springfield professional households in the 1850s, unusual enough to attract notice. Lincoln had arrived at a philosophy of child-rearing that was less a formal position than a habitual response. He did not correct. He did not restrict. He did not administer the systematic discipline that the domestic advice literature of the period prescribed as essential to the formation of orderly character. His law partner William Henry Herndon, who shared a professional space with Lincoln 5 days a week in the Lincoln and Herndon Law Office in the Tinsley Building on Springfield's public square, experienced the domestic consequences of this philosophy directly on the Saturday mornings, when Lincoln brought the boys to the office while Mary managed the house without them. Herndon recorded in his notes that Willie and Tad would systematically dismantle whatever portion of the office was within reach, pulling law volumes from their shelves, emptying the coal bucket, distributing the contents of the inkstand across available surfaces, while their father sat in his characteristic posture with a legal document or a book open before him, appearing genuinely untroubled by the surrounding disorder. Herndon wrote that had any other man subjected him to the same situation, he would have said something plainly about it, but that with Lincoln the calculations somehow always resolved the same way. Nothing was said, the boys continued, and the papers were sorted again after they had gone. Lincoln told Herndon on the occasion when Herndon ventured a mild observation about the office's condition that he could not bring himself to feel anything but love for his children, and that the rest could be put right. In the house itself, this love expressed itself spatially in a freedom of movement that the domestic architecture of the 8th Street property accommodated in the straightforward way that a house with a yard and multiple rooms. Once its adult inhabitants have decided not to impose significant territorial limits on its youngest occupants, tend to accommodate. The boys went where they chose, made the noise that arose naturally from their activities, and treated the spaces of the house, parlors, kitchen, staircase, yard, as continuous rather than as a set of rooms with different behavioral requirements. Tad in particular, who had a speech impediment that made his conversation difficult for adults outside the immediate family to follow, and who had received no formal education of any organized kind by the time the family left for Washington, had the run of the domestic space with a completeness that visitors sometimes noted with evident uncertainty about the appropriate response. Willie, 2 years older and by temperament somewhat more focused, was the boy in whom Lincoln most clearly saw a reflection of his own intellectual habits. The one who read with genuine absorption, who listened to adult conversation with attention rather than mere physical presence, and toward whom Lincoln's documented expressions of parental feeling are, in the surviving record, most specific and most consistently warm. The domestic staff who occupied the house alongside the family during the Springfield decade were, by the pattern the record establishes, employed under conditions that turned over with a frequency suggesting something chronic in the relationship between the household's requirements and the capacity of successive workers to meet them. Mariah Vance, who worked for the Lincoln family for approximately 14 years, and who was therefore the longest-serving domestic presence in the 8th Street house across its occupied history, later provided recollections of the household's interior that are the most sustained first-hand account available of its daily life. She described a house that was clean but not ceremoniously maintained, a kitchen that produced adequate food without particular refinement, and a domestic atmosphere in which the children's freedom and Lincoln's own physical ease within the household, his slippers, his shawl, his tendency to settle on the floor with whatever he was reading, created an interior environment that was distinctly the product of its occupants' habits rather than of any external standard of domestic presentation that either adult was consistently enforcing. Lincoln's physical habits within the house were specific enough to have registered with everyone who observed them. He wore a gray woolen shawl across his shoulders in place of a coat during the cooler months, a garment that served its thermal purpose without concession to its social effect. He read in positions that the furniture of the period was not designed to accommodate, stretched across the parlor sofa, with his legs draped over the armrest, or lying flat on the sitting room floor with his feet elevated against the wall, and a book held above his face, the same posture that neighbors in Indiana had observed 30 years earlier by firelight. He moved from room to room following the available natural light through the house's windows as the day progressed, an unconscious tracking of illumination that was a habit of man who had spent his formative years reading in conditions where light was a limited and carefully managed resource. He carried his reading with him through these migrations without interrupting it, and the household's other occupants appear to have organized their movements partly around the awareness that Lincoln, once established in a reading posture in a given room, would remain there until light or the text itself required him to move. The legal practice that financed the house's domestic operations required his departure from it for weeks at a time across 2 seasons of every year. The 8th Judicial Circuit covered 14 counties across central and eastern Illinois, and Lincoln rode it twice annually, in spring and in autumn, spending several days in each county seat as the court calendar moved through its established sequence. He was unique among his circuit contemporaries in regularly riding the full circuit without returning to Springfield between county stops, a practice that his colleague Henry Clay Whitney, who traveled the circuit with Lincoln throughout the 1850s, and who preserved detailed accounts of those years in his later memoir, described with the specificity of someone who had sat next to Lincoln in many of the tavern rooms and boarding house parlors that constituted the circuit's private spaces. Whitney recorded Lincoln's circuit manner, his conversational ease, his narrative command, his habit of beginning a story in a low voice that gradually drew the room's attention without ever appearing to have been seeking it, with the admiring attention of a man who understood that he was watching a social intelligence operating at its natural level of comfort. The income the circuit generated grew steadily across the 1850s. By the latter years of the decade, Lincoln's annual earnings from legal practice had reached approximately $5,000 in productive year, a figure placing him comfortably among the most successful lawyers in Illinois and sufficient to finance the expanded household on 8th Street, without the financial anxiety that had been a recurring feature of Lincoln's earlier years. The Illinois Central Railroad matter of 1857, in which Lincoln sued the railroad to collect a legal fee of $5,000 that the company had declined to pay following a successful representation of it in a major case before the Illinois Supreme Court, demonstrated both the professional scale he had reached and the directness with which he pursued his own legitimate interests. He won the suit, deposited the fee, and applied the proceeds to the financial foundation of the household with the same matter-of-fact efficiency that characterized his financial management generally. The political dinners Mary Todd Lincoln organized during the latter years of the Springfield decade served a function that both Lincolns understood and neither particularly needed to articulate to the other. The house on 8th Street in the years from 1856 through 1860 was a location where Republican Party relationships could be formed and maintained in a particular atmosphere of domestic hospitality that makes certain kinds of political conversation easier than a courthouse corridor or a legislative chamber will permit. Mary managed these evenings with the same strategic attention she brought to the household's other social operations, overseeing the food, the seating, the pace at which the evening developed, and the particular calibration of who was placed in proximity to whom in the limited space of the Lincoln parlors. The guests who attended these gatherings noticed the competence of the management without always commenting on it directly, in a way that guests in well-run domestic spaces generally absorb the evidence of considerable effort without being specifically invited to observe it. In the final weeks of January 1861, as the implications of Lincoln's election to the presidency in November of the previous year were being absorbed and the practicalities of departure were becoming unavoidable, the house on 8th Street was packed, cataloged, and prepared for the family's absence. Furniture was stored, arrangements were made with a neighbor for the care of the property, and the accumulated domestic material of 17 years was distributed, crated, or left in place against an eventual return that Lincoln, in the private record, does not appear to have considered certain. He locked the front door on the morning of February 11th, 1861, and the domestic life he had built and inhabited within those 12 rooms. The morning yard, the parlor floor, the borrowed light moving to the windows, the noise of sons on the staircase, became, from that morning forward, something he carried in the interior rather than something he could walk back into at the end of a circuit ride. The farewell Lincoln delivered from the rear platform of the passenger car at the Great Western Railway Depot in Springfield on the morning of February 11th, 1861, was not written down until the train was already moving, when he asked the secretaries to help him reconstruct what he had said. He had spoken without notes, briefly, to a gathering of approximately 1,000 Springfield residents who had come to the depot in the gray winter morning to watch him go, and what he said, as it was subsequently reconstructed and published, contained the acknowledgement that he did not know when or whether he would return to the city, and the observation that the task before him was greater than that which had rested upon George Washington, a statement whose quiet precision makes it neither boast nor lament, but the flat assessment of a man who had been reading and thinking about the country's condition for several years and had arrived at an honest reckoning with what he was being asked to manage. The journey from Springfield to Washington took 12 days, moving northeast through Indianapolis, Columbus, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland, then east through Buffalo and Albany to New York City, then south through Philadelphia and Harrisburg, and finally, in a night passage conducted in deliberate secrecy after Alan Pinkerton's detective organization reported a credible assassination plot in Baltimore, a city that would need to be passed through on any conventional southern route. Through Baltimore in the early hours of February 23rd, arriving in Washington before dawn in circumstances that Lincoln himself later acknowledged had a quality of furtiveness he would have preferred to avoid. The decision to alter his travel arrangements and make the final leg of the journey in darkness, and at least partly in disguise, was made at the urging of Pinkerton, of Norman Buell Judd, and of Ward Hill Lamon, Lincoln's close friend and self-appointed protector from their shared Illinois years. And it produced in the immediate aftermath a degree of public ridicule in newspapers that had not been briefed on the intelligence behind it. Lincoln bore the commentary with the equanimity of a man who had made a difficult decision under imperfect information and then watched it be misunderstood, which was not a new experience, and which the subsequent 4 years would provide in sufficient quantity that the Baltimore passage would eventually seem, in retrospect, a mild introduction to the phenomenon. The executive mansion to which he arrived was a building whose condition in the winter of 1861 was considerably less impressive than its political function might have suggested. It had been constructed in the 1790s from Aquia Creek sandstone, occupied through several administrations, expanded and modified across more than 6 decades, and it showed its institutional history in ways that were immediately apparent to those entering it with fresh attention. The carpeting in the principal rooms was worn through in the corridors of highest traffic. The wallpaper in several of the staterooms was separating at the seams. The building's heating was inadequate to Washington's winters in its upper floors, and the lower floors carried, in the warmer months, a persistent smell that originated partly from the Potomac River flats lying south of the grounds. Land imperfectly drained and productive in summer, an odor of remarkable persistence, and partly from the fact that the surrounding grounds accommodated livestock and served a population considerably larger than its facilities had been designed to support. That public access was among the most structurally consequential facts of life in the executive mansion, understood as a private space, or rather as a building from which private space had been almost entirely evacuated. The ground floor was open to the general public with a liberality that had no equivalent in any subsequent period of the building's history. Visitors arrived in the mornings, sometimes in numbers that filled the corridor between the entrance and the east room, and waited on whatever seating was available for the chance to speak with the president on whatever business had brought them. The office where Lincoln conducted the bulk of his working day, a large room on the second floor at the southeast corner of the building, was accessible not only to the members of Congress, military officials, and cabinet secretaries who had professional claims on his attention, but to the general procession of office seekers, visitors, and individuals of various persuasions who had determined that their matter was sufficiently important to justify ascending the stairs and waiting in the corridor outside the office door. Lincoln referred to these visits collectively as his public opinion baths, and he spent a portion of nearly every working day receiving them, not because the press of wartime administration left him leisure for purpose, but because he appears to have genuinely believed that direct connection between the executive and the general public was worth the cost it extracted from his time. It was John Milton Hay, the younger of Lincoln's 2 principal secretaries, who left the most detailed continuous record of what life inside the executive mansion actually looked like from a position of daily proximity. Hay, who was 22 years old when he arrived in Washington in February of 1861 alongside his fellow Secretary John George Nicolay, occupied a room on the second floor of the mansion and moved through its spaces with an observer's intelligence that his diary and his letters preserved in language of considerable precision and occasional dry wit. He referred to Lincoln in his private correspondence as a tycoon, an affectionate shorthand that carried within it the fond irreverence of genuine closeness. Nicolay, for years older than Hay and the more formally organized of the two in his management of Lincoln's calendar and public correspondence, shared with Hay an access to Lincoln's daily life more continuous than that of anyone outside the immediate family, and the record they jointly preserved is indispensable to understanding what the executive mansion's interior reality looked like across 4 years of a wartime presidency. The building's furnishings became the subject of public controversy in the administration's first year through Mary Todd Lincoln's redecoration program, which consumed a congressional appropriation of $20,000 for the renovation of the mansion's furnishings with speed and thoroughness that left the account overdrawn by approximately $6,800 before the 4-year appropriation period had reached its first anniversary. Mary had traveled to Philadelphia and New York in the spring and summer of 1861, purchasing carpeting, wallpaper, furniture, and decorative objects from establishments including Alexander T. Stewart's department store on Broadway in New York, and the resulting renovation transformed the principal rooms into spaces that contemporary accounts described as genuinely improved in appearance and atmosphere. Benjamin Brown French, the commissioner of public buildings who was responsible for the mansion's physical maintenance, documented the expenditures in sufficient detail that the overage was established as a matter of official record. And Lincoln's response, where he became fully aware of the extent of the overrun, was documented by French and by other witnesses. He was angry in terms that were specific rather than general, saying that the appropriation had been spent on what he called flub-dubs for this damned old house, while the men in the army could not have blankets, a remark whose syntax and vocabulary are consistent across multiple accounts, and whose emotional directness is entirely consistent with the man those accounts describe in other contexts. On February 20th, 1862, William Wallace Lincoln, Willie, the son in whom both parents had found the deepest reflection of their own most valued qualities, died in a second-floor bedroom of the executive mansion, having turned 11 years old in December of the preceding year. He had been ill for approximately 3 weeks with a wasting fever that his physicians, including Robert King Stone, who served as the family's attending physician in Washington, identified as bilious fever, a diagnosis that most subsequent medical analysis has interpreted as typhoid fever, likely contracted from the contaminated well water supplying the executive mansion, whose proximity to the ground's drainage systems created conditions of acute hazard that the germ theory of disease, not yet established in American medical practice, would have identified immediately. Tad Lincoln had been ill at the same time and recovered. Willie did not. Lincoln was with his son when he died. The accounts of the hours that followed describe a man moving through the building in a state that those around him recognized as a grief different in depth from anything they had previously observed in him. He walked to the office of John George Nicolay and stood in the doorway and said, in words that Nicolay recorded, that his boy was gone and that he could not bear it, and then walked back to the corridor. In the days immediately following, Hay and others recorded Lincoln returning to the room where Willie's embalmed body lay in preparation for burial, remaining there for periods of some duration, in a behavior that those around him understood as a grief's need to repeatedly confirm what the rational mind resisted accepting as permanently established. Willie's body was placed temporarily in the receiving vault at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown, and Lincoln reportedly traveled there on more than one occasion in the weeks following the funeral. Ward Hill Lamon, who accompanied Lincoln on many of his movements through Washington, and whose attachment to Lincoln's physical safety had by that point extended to sleeping on the floor outside his bedroom door on nights when he was present in the building, later described these cemetery visits with evident discomfort at their frequency and at their apparent emotional purpose. What they represented in Lincoln's own experience is not preserved in his own words, but their recurrence across the weeks following the funeral is consistent with the behavior of a man for whom abstract grief required periodic confrontation with its physical evidence, and for whom the executive mansion, which had never constituted a private space in any functional sense, offered no adequate room in which the kind of mourning that requires solitude could be properly conducted. Mary Todd Lincoln's grief expressed itself through different channels and with different consequences. She was unable to enter the room where Willie had died for the remainder of the family's time in the mansion, and the green room, where his body had lain before burial, was also closed against her. She sought contact with her dead son through spiritualist practice, engaging a succession of mediums in sessions held in the mansion's smaller rooms across the subsequent 2 years. The medium who attended the most sustained series of these sessions was a young woman named Nettie Colburn Maynard, who later wrote a detailed account of her interactions with Mary Todd Lincoln, and to a lesser degree with Lincoln himself. In a memoir published in 1891, historians have assessed Maynard's accounts with the necessary caution that the passage of 3 decades and considerable commercial interest in Lincoln-related testimony imposes. But the broad outlines of the seance sessions in the executive mansion are corroborated by enough independent sources to be accepted as having occurred. even where specific details resist confident verification. Lincoln's own attendance at some of these sessions is similarly documented in a qualified way. Multiple accounts place him in the room on at least some occasions, but his private correspondence and his remarks to those he trusted make no direct reference to any genuine belief in the spiritualist premise, and it is more probable that he sat in those rooms as a form of attendance on his wife's grief than as a participant in her search for consolation through a method his own temperament was unlikely to accommodate. His grief found its primary expression in the interior management strategies that the previous decades had established as his characteristic response to what exceeded the ordinary range of daily difficulty. He read, he walked, and he did not sleep. The insomnia that had been a periodic feature of his earlier life became, in the White House years, something closer to a structural condition, a persistent inability to remain asleep through the night that the accumulated pressures of the war's daily developments reinforced with the regularity of a tidal pattern. Hay recorded instances of finding Lincoln at his office desk at hours placing him there well past midnight and before dawn, working through correspondence, reading, or simply present in the lamplight of the office with the aspect of a man for whom lying in the adjacent bedroom had become less tenable than remaining at the desk. Lincoln walked the corridor between his bedroom and his office with a frequency that those whose rooms gave them windows onto the corridor came to recognize as a familiar nocturnal sound of the building's particular life. And he walked the grounds in the early morning hours when the paths between the mansion and the War Department telegraphs were available for the kind of uninterrupted movement that the building's interior, full even in the nighttime hours with the ambient presence of guards, staff, and the sleeping occupants of adjacent rooms, could not fully provide. The dream Lincoln described to those closest to him recurred throughout the war years with sufficient consistency in its content and in his references to it that those who heard him describe it came to regard it as a significant element of his interior life. In the dream, he was aboard a vessel, described as singular in its design, moving rapidly through water toward a shore that he characterized as dark and indefinite. He mentioned the dream and recorded conversations in the periods preceding several significant military developments, and on the morning of April 14th, 1865, he described it to the members of his cabinet assembled for their regular meeting, telling them that good news was likely coming from the armies in the field, because he had had the dream the previous night. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy, recorded this exchange in his diary with the precision of someone who understood that he was transcribing a moment of some significance, though the nature of that significance, in Welles's record, was understood as being about military intelligence rather than premonition. Lincoln was shot that evening at Ford's Theater and died the following morning. Welles was among those present at the deathbed on 10th Street, recording the night's events in language of measured and genuine grief. The physical deterioration that 4 years in the executive mansion produced in Lincoln was documented with a clarity that the era's developing photographic technology made unusually precise. The photographs taken by Alexander Gardner in February of 1865 show a face that had aged beyond a number of years elapsed since the photographs of 1860 or 1861. The lines deeper and more numerous, the eyes set further back in their sockets, the skin across the cheekbones drawn tight in a way consistent with the sustained weight loss that multiple observers had noted across the preceding year. Lincoln had carried, at the beginning of his presidency, a lean but not insubstantial physical weight for a man of his frame and height. By the winter of 1864 to 1865, that weight had diminished by an amount that those who had not seen him for intervals of a year or more recorded in their letters and diaries with something between concern and simple factual notation. The combination of persistent insomnia, irregular and infrequent eating. Lincoln was documented as frequently forgetting meals or declining them during periods of acute operational pressure, and the sustained physiological cost of carrying the cumulative weight of a war that had by early 1865 killed approximately 600,000 soldiers on both sides had produced, in the body of the man responsible for its conduct, the legible evidence of what such a sustained burden extracts over time. Frederick Douglass, who met Lincoln for the first time in August of 1863, finding him, as Douglass later recorded in his autobiography, to be the first great man he had talked to in the United States freely, who in no single instance reminded him of the difference of color, showing no consciousness of it and no embarrassment at it, met him again in August of 1864, and was among those who registered the change in his physical condition between the two encounters. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who visited the executive mansion in November of 1862 and subsequently published her observations on the administration's principal figures, described Lincoln as a man in whom the weight of the country's condition was visibly present in the physical surface of the face. What both Douglas and Stowe observed, from their different positions and for their different purposes, was the simple fact that the executive mansion was doing to Lincoln what institutions of that particular kind, those that combined total public exposure with the effective elimination of genuinely private space, tend to do to people their center. It was consuming him at a rate that the house on 8th Street in Springfield, with its yard and its kitchen and its window light moving through the familiar rooms of a life that belonged to him personally, had never managed and had, perhaps, been quietly protecting him from all along. Among the accounts that survive of Lincoln's humor as something other than social performance, few are as precisely situated in the historical record as the episode of September 22nd, 1862. Lincoln had called a cabinet meeting at which he intended to present, for the first time to the full assembled body, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a document he had been preparing since at least the previous July, and that he had withheld from public announcement since Secretary of State William Henry Seward had advised him, following a series of Union military reverses in the summer, that issuing it then would appear to the public as an act of desperation rather than a strength. The Battle of Antietam, fought on September 17th, had provided the military development that made the announcement viable, and the cabinet meeting of the 22nd was the occasion through which Lincoln intended to make his intentions known to those who would be most responsible for their practical execution. He opened the meeting by reading aloud from a recently published volume of comic sketches by the writer Charles Farrar Brown, who published under the name Artemus Ward, selecting specifically the chapter titled High-Handed Outrage at Utica. He read with evident enjoyment. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Portland Chase, whose diary entry for that day is among the primary records of the meeting's proceedings, noted the reading with a brevity that does not conceal his estimate of its appropriateness to the occasion. Secretary of War Edwin McMaster Stanton appears, from the accounts that survive, to have been similarly unmoved. When Lincoln had finished, he told those present that he thought it was a very good piece, set the book aside, and then proceeded to read the Emancipation Proclamation in its preliminary form, the document on which the remaining years of the war and the future condition of approximately 4 million enslaved people substantially depended, to a room that had arrived expecting something weighty and been made to wait for it through an Artemus Ward sketch. The sequence was not accidental, and those who knew Lincoln well enough would not have found surprising. It was not a reverence toward the proclamation, but the application of a principle Lincoln had developed and refined across decades of living with a kind of interior pressure that, without regular relief, becomes physically and mentally unsupportable over time. He had told those closest to him on more than one occasion that he laughed because he did not weep. And while this formulation has the cleanness of an aphorism that the messy reality of any psychological condition rarely fully matches, it nonetheless captures something accurate about the function that comedy served in his daily management of what had, by the 4th year of the war, accumulated the pressures that made the 1841 Springfield crisis seem, in retrospect, a provisional rehearsal. The humor was specific in its preferred structures. Lincoln favored the slow anecdote, the story that required several minutes to build, that accumulated its details with apparent unhurriedness, that seemed to be moving toward one destination and arrive at another, and that reached its conclusion by a route the listener had not anticipated but that felt, once traveled, entirely inevitable. John Milton Hay observed in his diary that Lincoln could hold a room's attention through a 20-minute narrative without raising his voice or altering his conversational pace, and that the attention was maintained not by the accumulation of suspense, but by the peculiar quality of Lincoln's narrative presence, by the sense that he was genuinely invested in the correct execution of the telling, which communicated itself to listeners as a form of respect. He kept on his office desk throughout the war years the published writings of David Roslock, who wrote under the name Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby, whose satirical sketches Lincoln read with regularity sufficient to have suggested to multiple observers that the reading served a maintenance function as much as an entertainment one. He shared the Nasby writings with cabinet members, secretaries, and visiting generals with the enthusiasm of a man distributing a remedy he had found reliable under testing. The philosophical territory immediately adjacent to Lincoln's humor, the question of what he actually believed about the nature of existence, about death, about the divine, is among the most genuinely contested in the entire biographical record. Contested not because the evidence is thin, but because those who knew him best did not agree among themselves, and their disagreement is itself a significant piece of evidence about the man. William Henry Herndon believed that Lincoln was, at his foundation, a man without conventional religious faith, a rationalist whose engagement with Scripture was primarily literary, and whose approach to theological questions was essentially skeptical, however carefully that skepticism was managed in its public expressions. Mary Todd Lincoln, particularly from the period following Willie's death to the end of the war, believed her husband had become a genuine and sincere Christian in the fullest doctrinal sense of the term, and she expressed this conviction in her later correspondence with an emphasis that her personal need for belief cannot entirely account for. John Milton Hay, whose daily proximity to Lincoln across 4 years gave him an observation post more continuous than any other source outside the immediate family, recorded in his diary a man who spoke of God and providence in terms that were neither casual nor conventionally pious, and whose private spiritual life resisted placement within any established denominational framework that Hay could confidently name. What the documentary record does establish, without significant dispute, is the following. Lincoln never formally joined a church across the entirety of his adult life, in Springfield or in Washington. He attended services at the First Presbyterian Church in Springfield with sufficient regularity that Pew was associated with his household, without ever becoming a member of his congregation. In Washington, he rented a pew at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church, where Reverend Phineas Densmore Gurley served as pastor, and Gurley, who conducted the funeral service for Willie in February of 1862, and who spent considerable time with Lincoln during the grief that followed, spoke of his impressions of Lincoln's spiritual condition, with a discretion suggesting he understood the question to be genuinely complex and not amenable to simple summary. Lincoln prayed in private, by the account of those who observed him in private circumstances, and this practice appears to have intensified as the war's accumulating costs removed other forms of consolation from reliable availability. He quoted Scripture with an ease and precision that required either sustained engagement with a text or a natural memory of considerable power, and in Lincoln's case, it was clearly both. He had written a speech in January of 1842 about what he called the doctrine of necessity, the belief that the human mind was impelled to action by some power over which the mind itself had no control, and that this understanding of human experience was the one he found most consistent with his observation of how the world actually operated. This philosophical fatalism never departed his expressed thinking, and it resurfaces in various registers across his later writing, arriving in its most fully considered form in the second inaugural address of March 4th, 1865, where the theological language of providence and divine purpose is deployed to account for the war's origins and duration in terms that are neither conventionally triumphant nor conventionally penitential, but are instead the product of a mind that had been thinking seriously about the relationship between human agency and the larger forces that human agency moves within for a considerable portion of an adult life. When accused during the 1846 congressional campaign by his political opponent, the Methodist circuit preacher Peter Cartwright, of holding religious infidel views, Lincoln addressed a charge in a published handbill that stated he had never denied the truth of the Scriptures and had never spoken with intentional disrespect of religion in general or of any denomination of Christians in particular. The handbill was careful, precise, and deliberate in the limited scope of its positive claims, and that precision is itself informative, because a man wishing to assert straightforward orthodox Christian belief had available to him language considerably more affirmative than what Lincoln chose to employ. The theater was for Lincoln what the church, which prescribed forms and communal obligations, was not, a space he entered with consistency and quality of genuine absorption, suggesting it met a need that the formal community of religious practice could not. He attended performances across the full course of his presidency, in a city conducting a war, under conditions that his security-conscious associates regarded with persistent concern, and that he regarded with persistent refusal to alter his habits. He attended Ford's Theater with particular frequency. On the evening of November 9, 1863, he saw a performance of The Marble Heart at Ford's, in which the actor John Wilkes Booth played the leading role, and Ward Hill Lamon, who attended with Lincoln and who recorded the evening in his later memoir, noted that Lincoln watched Booth with concentrated attention throughout the performance. He corresponded with the Shakespearean actor James Henry Hackett on the subject of the plays with the engaged specificity of someone who had thought about Shakespeare in practical terms, with opinions about how particular lines should be delivered and which interpretations the text could and could not support on close reading. He told Hackett in a letter of August 17, 1863, that he had gone through some of the plays so frequently that he could recall passages from memory, naming Macbeth, Richard III, Henry VIII, and Hamlet as his particular favorites, and noting that he thought the soliloquy beginning with the words, "Oh, my offense's rank" in Hamlet was, if not equal to the to be or not to be passage in general estimation, perhaps the greater piece of writing in his own. The letter was subsequently published in a New York newspaper without Hackett's prior consultation with Lincoln, and Lincoln bore the embarrassment of having his private literary opinions enter public print with the characteristic response of a man who had arrived at some settled understanding of what public exposure actually costs and had decided accordingly which costs were worth contesting. What the theater gave Lincoln, in its most functional sense, was something the executive mansion had almost entirely eliminated from his available experience: a darkened room, a seat in which he was not required to perform any public function, and a sustained period of attention given entirely to something other than the war. He sat in the presidential box, itself a particular kind of semi-public space, visible to the audience below and yet elevated above the ordinary plane of social interaction, architecturally positioned between the public and the private in a way that perhaps suited him better than either fully public or fully private spaces ever quite managed to do. And he watched the genuine absorption of a man who had arrived at a location that asked nothing of him except his presence. His physical presence in any space he occupied was specific enough in its habits to have registered with everyone who spent significant time in his company. He walked with a gait that turned his toes slightly outward, and that produced, over the long distances he preferred to cover on foot, a distinctive pattern to wear on his boot soles that those who traveled with him on the legal circuit had occasion to observe at close quarters. He sat in positions that the furniture of the period was not designed to accommodate, his legs draped over an armrest at an angle only his unusual height could have produced, or his body arranged diagonally across a sofa with his feet elevated on one end while he held a book above his face. He ate with the irregular infrequency of a man for whom meals were a logistics problem to be solved when unavoidable rather than a pleasure to be anticipated. Apples and crackers, and whatever else was immediately at hand satisfied him when he was occupied with something more demanding of his attention, and the formal dinner hour was, by multiple accounts, frequently forgotten altogether during periods of acute operational pressure. He wore his clothing with a relationship to its social effect that could be described, with some precision, as indifferent, and those who accompanied him on the legal circuit, sleeping in the same tavern rooms and watching him dress in the morning, recorded the specific details of this indifference with the affectionate exasperation of men who had come to understand it as a fixed characteristic rather than a correctable habit. Joshua Fry Speed, who had moved back to Louisville, Kentucky in 1841, and had married Fanny Henning the following February, a marriage about which Lincoln had written to him with a candor regarding emotional uncertainty that he extended to virtually no other correspondent, maintained a friendship through letters and periodic visits across the two remaining decades before Lincoln's election to the presidency. Lincoln had spent several weeks at Speed's family farm, Farmington, in the summer of 1841, a visit that those who observed him during and after described as having provided a period of regulated domestic calm that helped to move out of the worst of the preceding winter's depression into something approaching functional stability. The correspondence between the two men in the period of 1841 to 1842, Lincoln writing with unusual directness about fear, about uncertainty, about the texture of his emotional experience, represents the most candid written self-portrait that Lincoln produced across his entire life, and its existence in the record suggests that Speed occupied a position in Lincoln's interior life for which nothing and nobody else was ever precisely substituted. Speed told Herndon, in the interviews through which Herndon assembled his biographical research, that Lincoln was the most difficult man to understand he had ever known in his life, that Lincoln's inner nature was accessible only through occasional involuntary expressions, through the moments when emotions surfaced faster than Lincoln's habit of self-containment could prevent, and that outside of those moments a man might spend years in daily proximity to him without arriving at confident knowledge of what was actually proceeding in his interior. Hay recorded in his diary that Lincoln was the most shut-mouthed man that ever lived, with a capacity for deliberate interior residence that his public position had stripped from every external equivalent. Mary Todd Lincoln told Herndon in September of 1866 that Lincoln was not a demonstrative man, that he had never asked about her feelings, nor had she expected of him, and she delivered this not as a complaint, but as a description, immediately qualifying it with the observation that Lincoln was attentive and kind in the practical matters of daily life, in ways that she regarded as the real substance of conjugal care. She said also that he had a very strong and precise sense of justice, that he could be moved but could not be moved from a conclusion he had reached by legitimate means, and that this combination of emotional depth and intellectual firmness was, in her direct experience, simultaneously the source of his greatest effectiveness and the quality that made him, in the closed rooms of a private marriage, the most particular kind of difficulty. Herndon's final assessment of Lincoln's mind, developed across 16 years of daily proximity in the law office on Springfield's public square, and refined across 2 further decades of biographical research, settled on a description of a man whose intellectual method was the opposite of conventional formal reasoning, who did not move from established principle to particular conclusion, but who fastened on the concrete specific and worked outward toward the general through a process that was more intuitive than systematic, and yet arrived at conclusions that withstood subsequent examination with consistency that Herndon found both admirable and, in its apparent effortlessness, slightly unnerving. He wrote that Lincoln's mind was deep and logical and cold, and then qualified each of those terms in ways that made the description something more than a set of abstractions. The depth was a genuine capacity to hold a problem at length until it had exhausted its own resistance. The logic was precision rather than pedantry, and the coldness was a discipline that prevented feeling from corrupting judgment in the moments when the two were in direct competition. That was a private man. The one Speed found difficult to access, that Hay found deliberately closed, that Mary Todd Lincoln found specific in his kindness and immovable in his conclusions, and that Herndon found operating through an interior process that formal analysis could not quite replicate or predict. He had built himself, across a life whose first rooms offered almost nothing in the way of material resource or ready inheritance, into a figure of such singular combination. The humor and the darkness, the precision and the warmth, the absolute self-containment, and the absolute openness to certain kinds of human contact, that those who had known him most closely found, in the years and decades following his death, that describing him accurately was more difficult than describing almost anyone else they had encountered in their lives. Speed had said as much while Lincoln was still alive, telling Herndon simply that Lincoln was the most difficult man to know that he had ever met. Speed had known him by that point for more than 25 years, and the assessment had not simplified with the passage of time. In the small hours of a wartime night in the executive mansion, when the building's daily traffic had reduced itself to the essential minimum of guards at the doors and the last of the telegraph messengers had moved through the upper corridor, the place held Abraham Lincoln in the way that buildings hold the people who inhabit them, in a fixed spatial relationship between a man and his surroundings that offered less genuine enclosure than any room he had occupied across the preceding 5 decades. He had been born in a space of 16 by 18 feet that had at least a virtue of hearth within immediate reach. He had built from that beginning a life whose private architecture, the shared room above Joshua Fry's Speed store, the Globe Tavern's boarding house chamber, the house on 8th Street with its expanding rooms and its yard and its morning light moving through the southeast windows, had given him a series of physical containers within which the interior life could conduct its business with some degree of protection from the surrounding world. The executive mansion had dissolved that protection almost entirely, replacing it with a kind of omnidirectional public exposure that his late-night walks, his theater evenings, and his hours at the office desk in the building's quiet represented a sustained and ultimately insufficient effort to manage. What those who knew him best recorded, in the years after April of 1865, when they turned to work of accounting for what they had observed, was a man of specific and consistent interior, weather, the melancholy and humor operating as counterweights within the same emotional system, the intellect moving through problems by a process that was distinctly and recognizably its own. The private life behind the public record was not a contradiction of it. It was its source material. The firelight reading, the Pigeon Creek farm where a mother was buried and a stepmother arrived with furniture, the room above the store, the house on 8th and Jackson, all of it accumulated and carried forward into the building on Pennsylvania Avenue where the work continued to the night in the lit windows of the upper floor. The house on 8th Street sat empty through those years, and it sits reserved now, on the same corner in Springfield, with the furniture in the rooms and the wallpaper Mary Todd Lincoln chose still on the walls. It is quiet in the mornings, when the first light comes through the southeast windows. The stillness it holds is a particular stillness of a private life that went somewhere else and did not return. Writing this script took longer than I expected, and not because the research was difficult. It was difficult. Lincoln's private life is documented with an unevenness that forces you to constantly re-examine what the record will actually support versus what the mythological weight of the man has quietly installed in its place. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Lincoln resists reduction. Every time I thought I had a section under control, something in the primary sources complicated the picture in a way that felt genuinely wrong to set aside. That discomfort, in the end, made the script better. When the material pushes back, the writing tends to stay honest. The thing I am most satisfied with here is the architectural thread. Following Lincoln to the physical spaces of his life, from the one-room cabin at Sinking Spring Farm to the executive mansion's utterly evacuated privacy, turned out to be a more productive organizing principle than I gave it credit for when I first put it in the plan. It is one of those ideas that sounds somewhat mechanical when you describe it on paper, but that opens things up when you actually apply it to material. The rooms carry the story in ways that purely biographical narration does not quite reach. Lincoln's relationship to private space, and the way the presidency eliminated it almost entirely, is a genuinely revealing lens on why the man looked the way he looked by 1864. That thread held from the first section to the last without announcing itself, which is what it needed to do. The research held up. I was careful with the Rutledge material. That territory has been handled badly in both directions by people who either overclaim the romance or dismiss it entirely. And I think the script lands in the right place of honest uncertainty. The 1841 breakdown letters are among the most direct documents Lincoln ever produced, and they belonged in this script. The Joshua Speed relationship needed the space it received, because it is genuinely the most candid relationship in Lincoln's adult record, and it would have been a real loss to reduce it to a supporting detail. Now for the honest part, because a script this long has nowhere to hide its weaknesses. Section 5 is the densest section by a meaningful margin, and you can feel it when you read it against the others. The White House material covers more ground than any single section can carry comfortably. Willie's death, Mary's grief, the seances, Lincoln's insomnia, the recurring dream, the physical deterioration, Frederick Douglass, the photographs. Each of these would sustain significantly more development than they received, and some were compressed in ways that the final draft makes visible on close reading. If this script were extended or revised, I would split the White House material into two separate sections. One focus on grief and domestic loss in 1862, one focus on Lincoln's daily operational habits and physical condition across the war's later years. The material is there. It needed more room than one section provided. The Mary Todd Lincoln sections, spread across sections 3 and 4, are the area where I feel the editorial tension most acutely. She is a genuinely complicated historical figure who has been flattened in the popular record, and restoring some of that complexity, without losing the script's central focus, required discipline that did not always sit comfortably. There is more to say about her than this script said. That is a real limitation, and I am naming it because pretending otherwise would not be fair to the subject or to the listener. The tone held, which is the thing that matters most on a channel like this. One wrong sentence, too urgent, too emotionally insistent, breaks what you spent an hour building. I held every paragraph to that standard, and I believe it stayed consistent across the full length. That is my honest read on this script. If something landed differently for you while you were listening, drop in the comments. I read them, and I mean that.